The airplane was moments away from takeoff, with the usual buzz of pre-flight energy filling the cabin. Passengers were settling into their seats, chatting quietly or staring out the windows, eagerly awaiting departure. However, one encounter would soon shatter the calm atmosphere, an exchange that would set the stage for an unforgettable turn of events. As the last few passengers boarded, a flight attendant named Emma made her way down the aisle, scanning the cabin one last time before the flight began. It was then that her eyes fell upon a man seated in one of the first-class seats. He appeared calm and composed, his dark suit well-tailored, and his posture exuding quiet confidence. He had the air of someone who was no stranger to this world of luxury. His name was Charles Matthews, tall, with sharp, dignified features and a presence that naturally commanded attention. "Where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories." Charles had traveled for business for many years, and flying first class had become second nature to him. He walked briskly through the airport, his leather briefcase swaying slightly with each stride, a clear indication that he was someone used to moving with purpose. He hadn't been concerned about a thing during his journey through the terminal, it was just another day. His boarding pass, neatly tucked away in his jacket pocket, was simply a formality. The airline staff had scanned it without hesitation, as had the flight attendants when he boarded the plane. Emma was no stranger to first-class passengers. Most were business professionals, dressed in tailored suits or expensive dresses, all walking with the same air of importance. But as Charles took his seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this man was different. She had seen him enter with such quiet confidence, yet there was something about his demeanor that suggested he wasn't just another passenger. Emma smiled at the thought, dismissing the feeling. After all, it was a normal day, and this was just another flight. She had no reason to suspect that her interaction with Charles Matthews would take such an unexpected turn. But as the plane's engines hummed to life and the cabin started to settle, Emma would soon be faced with a situation she had never anticipated. A simple question about a boarding pass would soon unravel a web of assumptions and misconceptions that would completely change her understanding of the man seated in front of her. Charles Matthews, dressed in his perfectly tailored suit, continued down the narrow aisle of the plane as he made his way to his first-class seat. With each step, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone used to this routine. His briefcase swung gently at his side, and his polished leather shoes clicked softly against the aisle carpet. As he passed by other passengers, many dressed similarly in business attire, it was clear they were all part of the same world, one of importance and comfort. Yet Charles felt the familiar hum of the aircraft and the peaceful rhythm of the flight settling over him like a warm blanket. He reached his seat and glanced briefly at the overhead compartment, where he would stow his briefcase. A slight smile tugged at his lips. He had flown countless times before, always opting for the first-class cabin. It was not just about the luxury, though that was a welcome perk, it was the sense of order and control it provided. First class had always felt like his sanctuary away from the demands of business meetings, the constant barrage of phone calls, and the ceaseless movement of his career. His seat by the window offered a perfect view of the sky, with the clouds slowly turning from white to soft shades of gray. For a brief moment, Charles let his gaze linger on the horizon, taking in the sight of the world outside. The engines hummed steadily, and the gentle motion of the plane made it easy to forget about the stress of the day. It had been a long week, and this flight was his chance to reset, to clear his mind before plunging back into the whirlwind of work that awaited him at his destination. As he sat back and closed his eyes, letting out a quiet sigh, he felt the steady rhythm of the plane as it began to taxi toward the runway. He was no stranger to this sense of calm before the storm. Flights like this, simple and routine, were a welcome break from his usually hectic schedule. He had always appreciated the stillness they offered, allowing him to gather his thoughts and prepare for what lay ahead. Today was no different, until, of course, the moment when it all began to change. Just as Charles began to relax, his brief moment of peace was interrupted by the distinct sound of approaching footsteps. He opened his eyes to see Emma, the flight attendant, walking briskly down the aisle toward him. Her professional demeanor was clear, but there was something slightly off in her expression, an odd combination of politeness and something else that Charles couldn't quite place. Emma reached his seat, her gaze scanning him quickly, before her eyes settled on the boarding pass resting on the armrest next to him. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and her lips pressed into a thin line, as if deep in thought. "Excuse me, sir," Emma said, her voice smooth but with a sharp edge. "May I see your boarding pass?" Charles sat up straighter in his seat, a small crease appearing between his brows. The question itself didn't bother him, but there was something in the way Emma had asked it that made him uneasy. Still, he remained calm. He had flown countless times before and was no stranger to the occasional question or verification. But the look in Emma's eyes felt different, more scrutinizing. Without a word, Charles reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the boarding pass, handing it over to her. He watched her take it with a small flicker of suspicion in her eyes. For a moment, Emma didn't say anything, her gaze shifting from the boarding pass to Charles and then back again. Her hesitation was noticeable, and Charles couldn't help but feel a small spark of confusion. What was this about? "First class?" Emma asked, her tone almost disbelieving. She asked the question twice, as if trying to confirm she hadn't misunderstood. "Yes, that's correct," Charles replied, his voice steady and even. He remained composed, although internally, a flicker of uncertainty began to form. Why was she questioning him like this? It was a simple first-class reservation, nothing out of the ordinary. Emma hesitated once more, her eyes darting back and forth across the boarding pass, before she finally spoke again. "I'm sorry, sir, but I need to verify something," she said, her voice now cooler than before. Without another word, she turned and walked quickly toward the front of the cabin, leaving Charles staring after her, an unsettling feeling settling in his chest. What was going on? Why was he being treated like this? Charles Matthews sat back in his seat, his thoughts racing as he tried to make sense of the strange interaction with Emma. His brief moment of relaxation had been shattered, and now a vague sense of discomfort gnawed at him. He had flown first class many times before and had never been questioned in such a manner. His mind kept replaying the exchange, Emma's piercing gaze, her hesitation, the suspicion in her tone. Why was she treating him like this? Was there something wrong with his reservation? Had a mistake been made? The other passengers, who had been quietly settling in around him, now seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. A few glanced his way, their whispers soft but unmistakable. Charles couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in the cabin was watching him, wondering what was going on. The low hum of the plane seemed to grow louder in his ears, and the weight of the situation hung heavily in the air. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Charles waited, trying to stay calm and composed. He had dealt with far more stressful situations in his career, but this felt different. It wasn't just the questioning of his ticket, it was the palpable tension that had settled over the cabin, as if something far more significant was at play. He glanced around the cabin, noting the subtle glances from other passengers, their curiosity barely masked. The soft murmurs of conversation had picked up, and Charles couldn't ignore the rising sense of unease. Finally, the sound of footsteps approached once again. Charles didn't need to look up to know it was Emma returning. But this time, she wasn't alone. A younger flight attendant, a woman with an anxious expression, stood beside her. Charles's stomach tightened as the two women reached his seat. "Mr. Matthews," Emma began, her voice strained, "we need to ask you to move." The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Charles's brow furrowed in confusion. "Move?" he asked, his tone steady but laced with disbelief. "I'm in my assigned seat. Why would I need to move?" Emma's gaze flickered nervously to the younger attendant, who was still standing behind her, clearly uncomfortable. Charles's mind raced. Something wasn't right, and he could feel the tension escalating. He had paid for this seat, had confirmed his reservation weeks ago, and yet here he was, being asked to leave his seat without explanation. His patience was wearing thin, and the frustration that had been building in his chest finally began to surface. "I've been flying with your airline for years," Charles said, his voice firm but calm. "I've paid for this ticket, and I expect to be treated with respect. I'm not going anywhere until I understand why this is happening." Emma hesitated, glancing between the younger attendant and Charles. The discomfort in the air was palpable. Charles could see the doubt in their eyes, Emma's eyes filled with uncertainty, and the younger attendant's nervous glances only made the situation worse. There was no mistake with his ticket. There was no reason for this. And yet, he was being questioned like a common passenger. The tension in the cabin continued to build, and Charles knew that something was about to give. The next few moments would determine not just his own fate on this flight, but the fate of the airline as well. The tension in the air felt as though it was thickening by the second. Charles Matthews sat in his first-class seat, his frustration mounting as he tried to make sense of the situation. He had flown with this airline many times before, yet here he was, being questioned about his seat. Emma and the younger attendant's unease was palpable, and the passengers around him were watching, whispering, and exchanging glances. The entire cabin had become a quiet theater of uncertainty. After a few long moments of silence, Emma, the flight attendant, finally spoke again. Her voice was still careful, but there was a new layer of uncertainty creeping into her tone. She hesitated before addressing him, clearly aware of the rising tension. "Mr. Matthews," she began, we need to ask you to come with us." The words were polite but devoid of the confidence that had marked their previous interaction. Charles's brow furrowed further, the confusion still lingering. He could feel his patience slipping. Something was wrong, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was escalating for reasons he didn't fully understand. "I don't know why I need to leave my seat. I paid for this ticket, and it's my seat," Charles said, his voice calm but laced with growing frustration. Emma hesitated again, her gaze flicking nervously to her colleague, the younger attendant. It was clear they were both uncomfortable. The silence stretched on for several more moments before the younger woman finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's been a mistake with your reservation," she said, but her words lacked conviction. Charles didn't buy it. A spark of realization flickered in his mind. Something wasn't right about this entire situation. It wasn't just a mistake. There was more going on here, something deeper, but what? Then, as though the weight of the moment had finally caught up with her, Emma's voice broke through the silence again. "Mr. Matthews, we apologize for the misunderstanding," she said, her voice lower now, tinged with regret. She paused for a long moment before adding, "We didn't know who you were." At that moment, Charles realized the truth. They hadn't known who he was. They hadn't known that Charles Matthews was not just a regular passenger. He was the owner of the airline, the very company they worked for. The irony of the situation hit him like a wave, and for a brief second, he felt the weight of the power he held in this moment. "I think," Charles said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to have a conversation about respect and accountability." He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him now, their curiosity mixing with their surprise. What had just happened? Why had the flight attendants treated him like this? It was clear that this moment had become much more than a simple misunderstanding, it was a revelation. And now, there was no turning back. Charles Matthews sat back in his seat, his mind racing as he processed everything that had just unfolded. The revelation that he was the owner of the airline had thrown the flight attendants into a frenzy of apologies, but Charles wasn't ready to let the incident go with just a few words of regret. It wasn't about the apology, it was about something deeper. This wasn't just an isolated mistake, it was a symptom of a larger issue, one that needed to be addressed at its core. As the plane continued its smooth flight through the sky, Charles remained silent, his thoughts swirling. His calm exterior betrayed none of the frustration building inside of him. He had made his point clear to Emma and her colleague, but it wasn't just about what had happened in the air, it was about the systemic problems within the airline, the assumptions made about passengers, and the lack of respect shown towards someone who was supposed to be valued. The situation had made it clear to him that change was needed, and it needed to come from the top down. He had to act quickly. He reached for his phone, dialing his legal team and preparing to move forward with legal action. He needed to ensure that the airline understood the gravity of this situation. It wasn't just about this flight, it was about sending a message to the entire company that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. "Make sure we have a meeting with the senior executives as soon as we land," Charles said, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't going to be swept under the rug. We need to discuss accountability and how we can make sure something like this never happens again." As the hours passed, Charles couldn't shake the weight of the situation. He had spent years building his career and establishing himself in the business world, and now, in this moment, he was being treated like an ordinary passenger. A mistake, yes, but it was a mistake rooted in assumptions, biases, and a culture that needed to change. His mind drifted to the larger picture. If he wanted to make a real impact, it wouldn't be enough to fix this situation alone. This was about overhauling the entire company culture, ensuring that respect and equality were at the heart of the airline's operations. It was about leading by example, demonstrating that the company's success should never come at the cost of dignity and fairness. Charles Matthews was not one to back down from a challenge, and he wasn't going to let this incident slide. This was only the beginning of a much bigger fight, a fight for respect, fairness, and the future of the airline. The days that followed the incident on the flight were filled with tension and action. Charles Matthews knew that it wasn't enough to simply make his point to the flight attendants. He had to ensure that the airline took full responsibility for what had happened and that the company would face the consequences of its actions. This was no longer just about a mistake, it was about fixing a broken system, about addressing the culture within the airline that allowed assumptions, biases, and disrespect to flourish. As soon as the plane landed, Charles took immediate action. He instructed his legal team to prepare for a meeting with the senior executives at the airline, demanding answers. He didn't want excuses. He wanted accountability. The first step, Charles decided, was to make sure the airline understood the gravity of the situation. He had spent years building this company, and he wasn't about to let it be defined by a single moment of oversight. "I want a full investigation," Charles instructed his legal team as they made their way to the conference room. "I want to understand how something like this could happen and how we can ensure it never happens again. This is bigger than just one incident. It's about the culture we've allowed to develop here." Charles knew that change had to come from the top. If the company was going to move forward, it needed to address the root causes of the problem. He wasn't interested in a quick fix. New training programs or a few policy revisions wouldn't be enough to change the deep-seated issues he had witnessed firsthand. It would take a concerted effort, a shift in mindset across every level of the company, to ensure that respect and fairness were central to the airline's operations. The executives at the meeting were visibly nervous, their faces a mix of concern and professionalism. They had heard Charles's demands, and they knew that this wasn't just another corporate grievance. This was the owner of the airline standing in front of them, demanding change. "I've heard your assurances before," Charles said, his voice firm, his gaze unyielding. "New training programs won't fix this. We've had policies in place for years, and yet this happened. What I need to hear from you is that you understand this isn't just a policy problem, it's a cultural one. If we don't address that, all the training in the world won't matter." The room fell silent. Charles's words had made it clear, this was just the beginning of what would become a larger movement for change within the company. He wasn't backing down, and he wasn't going to let the airline continue down a path of complacency. The real work was only just starting. Despite Charles Matthews' clear demands for change, the response from the airline's leadership was not as swift as he had hoped. The executives had agreed to initiate new training programs and review their policies, but something felt off to Charles. As he moved forward with his efforts, it became clear that the company's promise of reform was merely a surface-level attempt to address a much deeper problem. In the days following the meeting, Charles began to hear whispers of resistance from within the company. While the senior executives appeared on board with his vision for change, some of the employees, especially those in positions of power, were less than enthusiastic about the new direction. There were murmurs of going through the motions, a quiet pushback that suggested many were unwilling to confront the cultural issues that had led to the incident. Charles could feel the tension growing. He had built this company, and he knew it inside and out. But this new challenge, the resistance to change from within, was something entirely different. It wasn't just about fixing the public perception of the airline. It was about transforming the very heart of the organization, and that meant tackling internal complacency and bias head-on. "Prepare for pushback," Charles said, his voice steady but tinged with concern as he addressed his team. "We're about to take on something far bigger than a few bad actors on the ground. We're confronting a culture of complacency that's been allowed to fester for years." The resistance became even more pronounced when Charles noticed that some of the senior managers, the very people who were supposed to champion the company's transformation, were reluctant to get on board with the new initiatives. They felt threatened by the changes and feared the consequences of truly examining the company's past behaviors. Charles was undeterred. His resolve only grew stronger as he recognized the extent of the challenge. This wasn't about a quick fix, it was about rebuilding an entire company culture from the ground up. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he wasn't willing to back down, especially not now, when the potential for real change was within reach. The battle was far from over. Charles continued to engage with the media, calling for transparency and demanding that the airline's leadership take responsibility not just for the past incident, but for every unfair situation that had been allowed to happen before. He wasn't going to let the resistance deter him. The fight for respect, dignity, and fairness had only just begun. The internal resistance within the airline was stronger than Charles Matthews had anticipated, but it also provided him with an invaluable opportunity, an opportunity to shift the culture of the company in a way that would have lasting effects far beyond the initial incident. Charles had always known that true change required more than just policies and training programs. It required a fundamental transformation in how the company viewed its passengers, its employees, and even itself. The battle was no longer just about holding individuals accountable, it was about creating an entirely new atmosphere within the airline. Charles understood that this would not happen overnight, but he was determined to lead the charge. He couldn't allow the company's deep-rooted complacency to continue. He knew that if he wanted the airline to thrive in the future, it had to start with a culture of respect and inclusivity. As the days passed, Charles began meeting with employees across all levels of the company. He didn't just want to hear from the senior executives or management. He wanted to know how the airline's employees, from the ground crew to the flight attendants, truly felt about the changes he was demanding. He had already witnessed firsthand the lack of respect some passengers experienced, but he also knew that the company's employees were equally affected by the culture that had been allowed to flourish. One by one, employees began to speak out. It started slowly, tentatively, even, but as more voices joined the conversation, the shift became undeniable. Employees shared their stories of discrimination, of seeing passengers treated unfairly, of moments when they felt powerless to speak up. These were not just isolated incidents, they were a pattern, one that had been overlooked for far too long. Charles listened intently, his face softening with empathy as he absorbed the stories. He knew that these employees were not just speaking about themselves, they were speaking for the passengers who had been affected by the same biases and assumptions. This was no longer just about a single misunderstanding. It was about the culture that had allowed those moments to happen again and again. As the resistance from senior management slowly waned, the airline began to take small but meaningful steps toward true change. Charles understood that it would take time to dismantle the ingrained biases and prejudices, but the journey had started, and that was the most important step. The fight for respect and fairness wasn't over, but the foundation for a more inclusive and equitable company was being built. It was a long road ahead, but Charles was determined to see it through, knowing that the impact would go far beyond this one company. It would set a new standard for the industry. As Charles Matthews continued to push for change within his airline, his efforts began to take on a life of their own. What started as a confrontation over a misunderstanding had evolved into a movement that went far beyond the boundaries of the company itself. The media caught wind of the situation, and soon, the story of the flight attendant's questioning of a first-class passenger, the owner of the airline, no less, had sparked a larger conversation about bias, discrimination, and the treatment of passengers in the airline industry. Charles had always been someone who led with purpose, and now he found himself at the center of a much broader issue. The conversation was no longer just about one flight or one misunderstanding, it had become about the systemic issues that plagued the airline industry as a whole. People were talking about how passengers, particularly those who didn't fit a certain mold, were treated differently based on assumptions about their status or appearance. It was a conversation that had been long overdue, and Charles knew that his actions could be the catalyst for real change. "I didn't set out to be the face of this," Charles said during an interview with the media. "But if my experience can help bring attention to the biases that exist in the industry, then I will use it to make sure things change, not just here, but across the entire airline industry." As Charles continued to speak out, the pressure on the airline mounted. His legal team had already begun gathering evidence and preparing a case, but Charles knew that there was more to be done. This wasn't just about the legal ramifications for the airline, it was about forcing the industry as a whole to reckon with its own shortcomings. It was about creating a new standard, one where every passenger, regardless of their appearance or background, was treated with the respect they deserved. The conversation began to spread far beyond the confines of the media. Other companies within the industry took notice, as did organizations outside of it. Charles had started a dialogue that reached deep into the fabric of the airline world and beyond. The question was no longer whether this issue would be addressed, but how quickly the industry would change to prevent future discrimination. As Charles sat in his office, reviewing the growing support for the movement, he knew that the real challenge was just beginning. The conversation had started, but it was up to him, and others like him, to ensure it led to real, lasting change. This was no longer just about one airline, it was about shaping an industry. And Charles Matthews was determined to be at the forefront of that transformation.